All right, so I got an update here for you guys on the potential of diplomatic solutions and off-ramps to the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. So here with a good breakdown on the latest from Common Dreams Jake Johnson. He says, Moscow says attack will end in a moment if Ukraine agrees to demands. So let's just go ahead and read about exactly what those demands are and if there's a potential of bridging this gap between the demands of Russia and the demands of the Ukrainian delegation. So he says, the Kremlin said Monday that Russia's deadly assault on Ukraine would end in a moment if the country's leadership agrees to a series of demands, including a firm commitment to not join NATO and formal recognition of two breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine as independent states. We're going to get into more of the details of exactly what these regions are. But they say Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov outlined Russia's demands in a phone interview with Reuters ahead of a third round of negotiations that are happening right now between Russian and Ukrainian diplomats on Monday, as the civilian death toll from the invasion continues to mount and the refugee crisis worsens. The latest on those numbers that I've seen is roughly 1.5 million refugees fleeing Ukraine, as well as hundreds and hundreds. It's obviously hard in the middle of a war to get accurate numbers, but anywhere from hundreds to even up to close to 1,000 civilians that have been killed so far. But they continue saying, in addition to diplomatic talks in Belarus, the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers are set to meet in person in Turkey on Monday, and the highest level meeting between the two nations since Russia's assault began late last month. And they say, quote, here are the very specific demands. They say they should make amendments to the constitution according to which Ukraine would reject any claims to enter any bloc. So talking about both the European Union and NATO. Peskov told Reuters on Monday, reiterating a long-standing Moscow demand, and this was something that they were saying was part of the justification for why Putin invaded. So this was something we already were pretty much aware of. They say we have also spoken about how they should recognize that Crimea, which is this territory down here in the south, this peninsula right here that was taken in 2014 or 2015, forget which exact year it was, but they recognize that Crimea is Russian territory officially. I mean, it effectively is already right now. It's being occupied by Russian troops, and so that would not be too much of a stretch, and that they need to recognize that the Donetsk and Lugansk are independent states, and that's it. It will stop in a moment. So they say that that's it, but then they continue saying that Peskov added that Russia is finishing the demilitarization of Ukraine, but denied that it is seeking to seize Ukrainian territory or to oust the country's national leadership. And they say Ukraine is an independent state that will live as it wants, but under conditions of neutrality, said Peskov. So this is where we kind of get into a gray area, because those first 3 points I kind of understand, not in the sense that I agree that Russia should have invaded in order to have those demands met. Obviously not. I'm completely against Putin's aggressive imperialist expansion right now. But those three first demands are sort of things that I think the Ukrainian delegation would be willing to work with. Okay, so just as a reminder, those three major demands are an agreement to never join NATO and to never join the EU, which, on the table before, I would have argued that we should have taken NATO membership completely off the table. And it really just comes down to a matter, we can have these conversations and say that Ukrainians deserve a right to self-defense. They absolutely do. But do they have a right to join a NATO alliance that would, if Russia ever invaded Ukraine, as they are doing right now, would basically spark off into World War III? And I personally think that the answer to that question of whether or not that would ever happen in any reasonable way is no. And the reality of the situation, unfortunately, for the Ukrainian people is that Russia and Moscow and Putin it has for years now considered Ukraine to be extremely important to their national security, extremely important to maintain as a sort of buffer state to the West. So the reality of the situation on the ground is the United States is not willing to use our troops. We are not willing to go to World War III to defend Ukrainian territory. And so the unfortunate, conclusion of that is that this is much more of a pertinent issue that Russia is actually willing to send their troops to go fight and die for than it is for the West or for NATO or for the United States. So I think that it's somewhat reasonable to completely take NATO membership off the table. EU membership is something that Ukraine actually just recently already applied for and was accepted for. Now, how long the logistics of that are going to take, I don't really know, but They would have to obviously also forego potential EU membership in favor of some other Russian pact or Russian agreement in the future. So those are the first two demands: never join NATO, never join the European Union. And the other ones on top of that are recognizing Crimea, which again was annexed in 2014 as Russian territory, and then also recognizing these regions over here, Donetsk and Lugansk, in the eastern portions of Ukraine as Russian territory. Now, I'm not exactly sure if he means just these regions that have already been occupied for years now by pro-Russian separatists, or if he means the entirety of essentially the Donbass region, and if he would mean that they would have to recognize along these yellow lines instead of these red lines. So those three things I could see, again, as potentials that the Ukrainian delegation would be willing to work with. Now, you get into the gray area when you get into these other two demands of saying finishing the demilitarization of Ukraine, because Ukraine is absolutely never going to agree, for pretty obvious reasons, to completely demilitarize their country. I mean, they literally just got invaded by their next door neighbor. Why the fuck would they ever agree to demilitarize? So I don't think that that's reasonable. Now, if what Russia means by demilitarize is that they're just going to flatten Ukraine to the ground, then I guess that's the trajectory that they are currently on. And if they think that that's a means of demilitarizing Ukraine, then that may be what they mean here. But they also say that Ukraine is an independent state as it wants, but it will live under conditions of neutrality. And they also say that they weren't technically planning on replacing Volodymyr Zelensky's government, which I find really hard to believe that they would actually be willing to leave him in power right now after how far that they have extended themselves into this conflict. If anything, it would be more likely that maybe they would keep Zelensky in, a sort of a fake position in government, like keep him as the president, but then have a pro-Russian prime minister that's installed that actually wields power in the country. So again, you're kind of entering a gray area on the first three things. I could see that working as potential diplomatic solutions, but if they're going to say that the Zelensky government loses power in any way, if they're going to demand that Ukraine completely demilitarizes, then that's not going to lead to any diplomatic solutions, and unfortunately the war will continue to escalate and continue in the devastation that we have been seeing so far. So this is basically the latest that I've seen. Again, we had another piece of information down here that's kind of important. They say the Washington Post reported that while Ukraine is open to neutrality in the sense of NATO and the EU, they say Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has ruled out an agreement that would compromise the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So if Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation is completely not willing to cede either Crimea or the eastern portions of the Donbass region, then I guess that these diplomatic talks are not going to go anywhere, which leads us to the conclusion that, if those demands are not able to be met, then again, we're just going to continue seeing this invasion continue until they flatten Kyiv and flatten Kharkiv and Odessa and all of these other major metropolitan areas in Ukraine to the ground. So, I obviously don't support what Vladimir Putin is doing, but you also just have to look at the current situation and weigh their options. And that's basically what's on the table right now in terms of a potential diplomatic off-ramp. If I was a U.S. representative, if I was Joe Biden, I would certainly be trying to push behind the scenes or openly to have this off-ramp provided and to try to work with the Ukrainian delegation and say, listen, if you're willing to make some of these concessions, then we will partner with Russia to de-escalate in terms of sanctions. And basically, as that quote from Sun Tzu that I said in my video the other day, provide your enemy a golden bridge to retreat across in an effort to try to de-escalate this situation and make sure that it doesn't, escalate into a broader war in Europe or one that inevitably leads to a nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia. Because with however bad the situation is right now, which it's absolutely catastrophically terrible, nuclear confrontation would definitely be worse. So we should be optimistic. We should be trying to push for these diplomatic solutions. Again, how realistic are they? I'm not exactly sure, but I guess I will have to keep you guys updated on exactly how some of these diplomatic talks go today and in the future.